We keep hearing over and over that right now already, some 800 million people don't have enough food to eat. Feed the Future is kind of the U.S.'s big initiative to help alleviate that. You know, what are some of the research approaches? You know, how do we begin, you know, getting down and dirty?
Well, thanks a lot. That's a huge question. So yeah, Feed the Future is
30 seconds. No. No.
Feed the Future is the U.S. government's global hunger and food security initiative, and it was started as a response to the global hunger problem, and attempts to try to ensure that those 800 million people do have enough food every day. So it's really focused on smallholder farmers, and it's working in close partnership with the countries around the world where Feed the Future works to try to really strengthen the agricultural systems in those countries and to respond to the priorities that those country governments have established for the agriculture sector in their country. So it's really country-led. So you asked about the research piece.
Yeah.
It was heartening to hear the discussion this morning and the various threads that kept coming up as to research needs, because I was sitting in the back and I was like, oh good, we're doing the right thing apparently. So we have a comprehensive research program under Feed the Future. We're investing in crop development. So we just heard about the need for crops that are more climate resilient. We heard about drought tolerant crops. So we're using the range of scientific approaches to try to improve crop tolerance. We have investments in livestock. We don't hear enough about animals when we talk about food security. Animals are a really fundamental part of many of the farming systems. It helps to ensure that we have diverse farming systems where we work. So we're investing in animal diseases, vaccines, for example. And then the whole range of agricultural systems research, looking at how you can sustainably intensify agricultural systems, diversify them, bring in the right rotations, the legumes on top of the cereals, on top of the livestock, and then all the support structures around that. How do farmers get access to the inputs they need, the seed, the fertilizer, the irrigation systems?
Luke, I deal largely with water issues. Obviously, the crops that we grow have a major water footprint associated with them. That's not always easy to account for in the food equation, though, is it?
That's right. Water security and food security are inextricably linked, and it takes water to grow food, which is such a simple insight that leads to very nuanced understanding of how, through the global water trade, we are redistributing the world's water supply. 70% of human water use goes towards agriculture, and not all water is created equal, and not all crops are created equal, in the sense that different crops have different water needs. So that a kilogram of wheat, I'm sorry, I'm going to speak in metric as a scientist, but a kilo of wheat is about a meter cubed of water. And when you go up the food chain to beef, we're talking about 5 meters cubed of water for 1 kilo of beef. And that has major implications for how we think about our water use for long-term sustainability. Climate change has a huge impact on this. And we're working in several areas at Johns Hopkins in collaboration with partners all over the world. And one of the projects that I thought would be relevant for today's discussion is in Ethiopia. We're looking at how climate change is driving farmers' choices for their crops. And this is a really important watershed that we're looking at. It's the Blue Nile watershed, which is where 85% of the Nile that reaches the Mediterranean begins. So this is the genesis of human civilization right here. And in that Blue Nile watershed, we're seeing massive amounts of erosion. So today I've heard a lot about technology, and the program that we're looking at in Ethiopia is focused on disseminating that information, which I think is the key step towards success. We see this all over the water sector.
That's great, and we'll definitely get to how do we actually get these things out into the field. Okay, so soil, largely talked about water. There's that other variable that we had is weather. Laura, it seems like we're already seeing a lot of at least significant changes to weather patterns. It's affecting farmers here in the U.S. and everywhere. You know, as we move forward, as we start, you know, having to grapple with 9 billion people, how do we kind of hone in on the right data? There's a lot of information out there. How do we kind of hone in on what's important?
That's right. Thanks for the question, and thanks for having me on the panel. You can see on the chart here, we do have the U.S. Drought Monitor, and so obviously the information is key. So we have information for the decision makers and for the farmers, so they better understand what crops to plant for the future, and historically speaking, what has done better and what has not. I think we're talking a lot about the traditional agriculture. I think we need to make sure that we're not forgetting about the fisheries as well, which will provide a lot of protein, significantly contribute to protein in particularly those poorer countries that need that information as well. So the Drought Monitor here is a partnership with the USDA and NOAA, and looks at areas where extreme drought is taking place. This comes out once a week. I'm excited to see what it's going to look like tomorrow when it comes out at 8:30 tomorrow morning, because we have seen some very needed rain in California, and that's one of our extremely drought-stricken areas.
Great. I guess this is for all of you. When someone comes from the outside and starts looking at the issue, it's overwhelming. You don't know where to begin. I guess how do you begin to kind of hone in on this is what we need right now in this spot? Is it these big global maps of drought and weather? Is it more on the ground numbers of people not getting enough food? How do each of you begin to kind of start?
I think you start from both ends. So we're looking in our research strategy, we're looking at global issues. How is climate change going to impact agriculture around the world? What are going to be the climate patterns? What are some of the emerging pests and diseases that really have the potential to impact farmers' livelihoods? But you have to start at the other end too. You need to be speaking with farmers. You need to understand what are the constraints they face. Maybe it's not a new seed variety they need. Maybe it's a better understanding of how to get credit so they can make the investments they want to make. So we're really coming at prioritization for a global initiative, which as you say is a huge challenge, from really both of those sides, trying to keep the big picture in mind, and then also really understanding what are the needs of the farmers, the systems they work in, how can we strengthen the systems, how can we work with the governments to help them better support the farmers where we're working.
I would completely agree that we need to start at both ends. And so one of the things that we look at is virtual water as researchers. And that's the concept I was just talking about, that each kilo of wheat has embedded in it water. And you can track that through the global food trade. And it turns out that just 5 countries account for 94% of all global water exports. And that number has shrunk over the past decade. And so currently the United States is leading the way in that group, along with Canada, France, Argentina, and Australia.
And Luke, when you're talking about water exports, you're not just talking about we're sending water. It's tied up in
That's right.
the that we're growing.
That's right. So each quantity of food represents a larger quantity of water that it took to create that food. And when you track that system, you see some dramatic things about how the countries are connected between the food supply.
We have your slide up there now, I think.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so that's one end. That's the big story. The other story that we look at is on the ground. And so as going back to that example from Ethiopia, a major problem right there is soil erosion that's driven by deforestation over the past 30 or 40 years. You take a forested watershed, and you can see a picture here of just dramatic gullies and channels, and that's widespread. And the solution to that isn't necessarily no farming, but it's smarter farming.
Right, and that's something that we're seeing even in California right now, right? Once you start changing the soil, then weather comes in and...
That's right, the extreme weather have significant impacts. So some of those mudslide areas in California right now are a result of burn scars from 2013. So the extreme weather, including wildfire activity, contributes downstream. There's a domino effect. Going back to the partnerships a little bit, through the World Meteorological Organization, we're partnering now with the World Health Organization to ensure that we can reach those networks within the community, because a lot of times it is difficult to reach down into the community to those more vulnerable areas. And so working with Red Cross and the Weather Service, we're able to go in and partner on some of our best practices as to how we're able to get in and reach those individuals within the community. Women, children, and the elderly are more susceptible to extreme weather. And so how can we ensure that our information that we're disseminating is actionable to those groups? We don't want to leave out the men, though, because men are vulnerable in regards to lightning strikes. 81% of all lightning fatalities are men. Huh. So we've got to incorporate the social science into our information that then, again, those folks in the more vulnerable communities, we understand what they need, and we get information out to them so then they can more proactively plant the proper crops and take the right actions.
And to follow up on that, I think partnership is the key.
Right.
So in our work in Ethiopia, we're partnering with Addis Ababa University, the University of Wisconsin, and together we're putting together the right expertise and local knowledge to tackle this problem.
That gets back to what I guess Dan and Ricardo were talking about earlier in terms of knowing what the needs isn't. It's not all top down here. We can see on our big global map that you have this problem and we're going to solve it for you. It's much more direct. So then, in that, I know all of you have a lot of techniques, relationships for getting that information out there. Saharah, why don't you take us through in terms of that farmer on the ground? You know, how does it work?
Well, a lot of our research is done in collaboration with farmers. So particularly our research around sustainable intensification, looking at what are the different options that farmers can use to improve their production or their efficiency on their farm. And so that research, the research plans are developed in consultation with farmers, and the research itself will take place often on farmers' fields. And so a farmer themselves will step up and say, I'd like to be the person in my village that tries out these different approaches. And they'll leave a part of their farm in what we call conventional practice, growing the usual varieties with their usual irrigation practices. They'll try perhaps a new variety on a little piece of their farm. They'll try a new way of tilling the soil or not tilling it, for example. And then if you do that across a number of different farms and a number of different villages, you start to get a picture of how these different approaches might pan out for farmers within a region. You can step back and then do a more sort of broader geographic analysis with that data that you might be doing back, say, in a lab somewhere in the United States. But the sort of impetus for that research and how it was designed and the data that you're getting are coming from the farmers themselves. So that's one way that you can really ground your research and make sure it isn't just top down, but that it's really taking advantage of what the farmers already know.
Yeah.
Why don't you give us some examples of some of the research, whether it's genetically modified crops or irrigation strategies?
So we have a program that's run for many years in South Asia called the Cereal Systems Initiative for South Asia. And so they work across rice and wheat systems mostly, and they're trying out a lot of different approaches, conservation, agriculture. There was some conversation earlier referred to herbicide and how it can denude the soil, but actually what they're looking to do is trying to maintain soil cover and prevent farmers from using practices that really degrade soil, like, for example, tilling the soil too much. So in South Asia, they've introduced zero-till agriculture, which is seeding your wheat seeds directly into the stubble. And they've actually found that in some cases, if you use herbicides, for example, you can facilitate that, and you can help the farmers maintain that soil cover. So a farmer could be doing that sort of research on their field. They're doing their regular tilling process. They're seeding those wheat seeds directly into the soil, and they're perhaps even trying out a new variety of wheat that might be higher yielding, and looking at those various combinations to see which might be best for their own farm.
Luke?
So to address the dissemination issue, I think as researchers, we have several roles. And so one is certainly to communicate with the local community about our study and what we're doing and what it means for them, and to set expectations realistically. A lot of times people think, well, you're here to solve all of our problems. So those kinds of discussions we certainly have. But the other way, and in fact, I was just thinking as you were talking that I was fortunate enough to participate in a study of a USAID multiple water use intervention in West Africa, the USAID West African Water Sanitation Hygiene Program. And there we could, as an independent research institution, provide some validation for the implementation that USAID was running. And we could see some really transformative impacts in terms of livelihoods when water systems are planned not just around drinking water, but around communal water needs, so small scale gardens for local businesses and for household consumption.
And we need that information to forecast the weather. So those farmers that are participating in these research projects, if they're taking observations at the same time, that will feed into our global telecommunications system, improving our forecast. Weather obviously knows no boundaries, and so that's some of the work I'm doing at the World Meteorological Organization, is ensuring that countries are signed up to, when they obtain observations, it's then shared, open accessibility to all that information. So the more information we have, the better our forecast can be. And our day 5 forecast today is as good as the day 2 forecast used to be. So we're continuing to improve upon our weather information and even our long-term forecasts. The high impact events are what we're spot on.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it's these more subtle events, the more routine, mundane weather that we don't really understand. Now we understand if it's a stagnation, not much airflow, that's an air quality problem that could then have other downstream health impacts as well.
That's interesting. So it goes from the bottom up that you're getting information and feeding back down to the.
That's right.
And that's going to get more important. I think Allison has a question.
Hi, I've got 2 questions here. One's coming from Twitter, and this is for Laura, I'm guessing. How will the depletion of groundwater in the western U.S. impact food production in 20 years, and what's the solution?
So that's an interesting question.
Yeah.
And that's where we have to better understand, again, the user requirements, and that's where some of the water wars are taking place. In California in particular, the vineyards need water, the salmon need water to come back upstream, the farmers need water, and recreational uses as well. So having those conversations on how to be more efficient with the usage of the water will help us ensure that we have that salmon on our plate for dinner and we have the wine to wash the salmon down.
And Luke, do you see that the virtual water plays into that kind of having a number that you can, like it's kind of like a carbon footprint, it's a water footprint?
Well, right now, when you think about virtual water, we can split it into blue water and green water. Green water is water that's freely available, so that's rainfall. And blue water is water like groundwater, irrigation, things that we have to engineer. And in fact, blue water is a small portion of the global food trade, global virtual water food trade, but it's a growing portion. And it's not a sustainable portion in many cases. In fact, I showed a picture here of Bangladesh. And in the 1970s, they introduced diesel generators, which were pumping groundwater now in the winter, which allows them to grow 2 rice crops per year. And that has implications for the soil geochemistry. We were looking at some arsenic problems in groundwater there. And it has implications for the long-term health of the water table.
Another question here. What's the role of higher ed in developing countries to produce human capital to provide the policies enabling environment, science, entrepreneurship, everything that's required to tackle this?
That's a great question.
It's critical. Higher education is absolutely critical to the agriculture enterprise. And we heard from one of our earlier sessions, the U.S. needs to step back up and play a larger role in helping to strengthen the capacity of agro-scientists, for example. But obviously it's not just the scientists, it's the capacity throughout the entire agricultural sector. So the policymakers, the extension workers, the farmers, and the educational and the research institutions. That's something that we prioritize a lot under Feed the Future. We have a number of collaborations through U.S. universities. You mentioned the Feed the Future Innovation Labs. Built into those research collaborations is an explicit focus on strengthening the capacity of scientists and researchers in the universities and the partner countries where we work. So there's students getting degree training here in the United States, getting degree training in their own home countries, but also there's an effort to look at the institutions that they work within and think about how you can strengthen those institutions and better position those academics or those scientists to collaborate, to work with, and to inform their policymakers so that the government itself can establish the right policies that's really needed to support farmers.
Is there a lack right now? Is there a lack of scientists entering this field?
There's always a lack of STEM scientists, and the capacity development, I think, is key here, because even in the National Meteorological and Hydrologic Services, there's many countries that don't have the world-class service that we have here in the U.S. And so we have an international desk that brings in scientists from other countries, teaching them how to forecast, and they take it back to their countries, and then they're able to give this information to their own individuals, where they're the honest broker, they're the person who's trusted. And so if they have someone in the community that's trusted giving them the information, folks will act on it more accurately. President Obama even mentioned this during the UN Climate Summit when he mentioned that we would be expanding these international desks that we have at NOAA.
Great.
Yeah, and I think that the lack of scientists entering it isn't necessarily a function of demand. I can guarantee you I probably have 3 emails that are new in my inbox this morning from students that want to study a PhD at Johns Hopkins that I can't accept. And the reason is that we don't necessarily have enough funding to support everyone that wants to be there. And you know, there's a long way that we can travel if we start to invest in higher education. And so that would be in terms of government or philanthropic investments that lead to these kinds of transformative trainings that you're talking about.
Right. Getting back to some of the research, not to, it sounds naive in some ways, but I think a lot of people think that we solved a lot of this stuff. Didn't we have this big green revolution 50 years ago and solved some of the hunger problems? Are any of those techniques viable now? Did we cause a bigger hole?
Yeah, I think the Green Revolution solved a number of problems in large parts of the world, certainly in South Asia, where crop yields increased due to better varieties, irrigation, access to fertilizer. We really saw averted a huge famine that was looming. A lot of the benefits of the Green Revolution haven't arrived to places like Africa. Very, very little arable land in Africa has irrigation of any sort, whether it's large-scale or small-scale irrigation. Farmers in Africa, on average, fertilizer use is about 8 kilograms a hectare, whereas the global average is 100, and many parts of the world where agriculture is very productive are much higher than that. So you could do a lot to bring some of the learnings of the Green Revolution, but you could do it in a very different way. You could think about how can you make it more sustainable? How can you allow farmers in Africa to get access to fertilizer, but in a way that allows it to be more sustainable? So thinking about what do you need to do to the soil? How do you increase carbon content in the soil itself so that if they are applying fertilizer, it's more useful? So that's, I think, the research we need today, is how to be more integrated and more sustainable in helping farmers get access to the tools that farmers in the rest of the world have been using for decades.
Agree.
That traditional knowledge, though. The traditional knowledge is important, but we have folks who are saying, I've never evacuated before, I've never had to change my crop before, so I'm not going to now.
Sure.
We can obviously improve on the practices, become more efficient with our water usage, but we also have to know that with climate change, more extreme events are going to happen. And now we have people saying, gosh, I never had water in the second story of my home, and I do now. What's going on here?
Right.
That's
and
right.
so we have to ensure that folks know this is different than it's ever been.
Right. Or I've planted this crop for generations.
Right.
Why would I switch now? Right? How do you convince people?
Switching crops is hard. People have very strong cultural attachments to growing rice, for example. Some of our research in South Asia is looking at future farming systems. So today farmers are doing rice-wheat rotations. Perhaps in the future, as the climate changes, as water is less available, they're going to need to grow maize or another crop. So we're doing the research. We're doing these demonstration trials to show how a farming system could look like in the future under different climate change scenarios. And it's a matter of education and making sure that information gets out. Farmers see the options they have available to them, and ultimately giving farmers the choice. It's not about coming in and saying you need to grow sorghum instead of corn. It's saying here are a range of options that you could use which might help you strengthen your resilience or increase your incomes or improve your diet. And it's about the farmer being able to make that choice.
Mm-hmm. And it takes years of commitment. I think that's a really important part of development work in general, is that it's one thing to give a set of options, but it's another thing to be there for the long term over several years while you can see the impacts of that and really reinforce your presence in the community. I think that's the most important ingredient.
Yeah.
This is one of the fundamental aspects of our Weather Ready Nation campaign. So folks are weather ready. In advance of the storm, the farmers know exactly what measures to take. Then they can get the information. Some of our weather information was coming out at 5:30 at night with the evening news, right? Well, that's when many of the female farmers are fixing dinner for their children. They're not getting the information. So again, having a better understanding of what those individuals on the ground need, the timeliness of when they need it, is all about a weather-ready nation or a weather-ready world. And that's more actionable information. People are prepared and they know what action to take.
Sure. I mean, in some ways, it's not as sexy as you know, modified.
Weather's sexy.
Well, no, it is sexy. No, it's very sexy. All the science is sexy,
Right.
but some of it is efficiency, right? Some of it is just doing things better. Luke, you were telling me a little bit about a project in Mexico City to conserve. Tell me a little bit.
Yeah, and that's just an example of all kinds of ways in which we can do creative urban infrastructure projects. So the example that I was showing you was using treated wastewater to irrigate farm fields. And that kind of forward thinking is what we need, both in terms of conserving energy that we use to treat waste, energy that we use to treat drinking water, and in terms of conserving water itself in water-scarce regions. So rainwater and stormwater management and better urban sewer management goes a long ways. Most cities in the world do not treat their sewage water. So I think that's a dirty secret that the water sector knows very well, that people outside of the water sector are shocked to learn. When you fly into the city of Lima, a city of 15 million people, you're going to fly over this little canal that's brown with the sewage of the entire city running out into the ocean. And that's the norm.
Water is just so important. We have a new National Water Center in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and we're going to be doing research on new practices of water. But it's a partnership with the USGS, the Army Corps of Engineers, FEMA, NOAA, many other visiting scientists coming in to help us develop a national hydrologic model so we can better understand our water resource management and the services and science that we need in order to get the information that our nation, and then help other countries with these practices.
Sure, I guess the efficiency it's not just water, it's all of it. I mean, the irony that we all face, I guess, is that, you know, a third of the greenhouse gases that we that's causing the climate change is going into the food that we eat, you know. Is there a way to grow that more efficiently with reducing that and maybe getting ourselves out of that hole?
Well, the title of this is interesting, Water is Power. So you can look at that in multiple ways. Green energy, of course, so hydropower is one mechanism.
Sure, sure.
Yes.
There's a lot of room for increasing efficiency in agriculture, even in smallholder agriculture, where, you know, I mentioned they have very, very little access to fertilizer. You could both increase their access to fertilizer, but also provide tools to increase their efficiency of that use, whether it's through a new crop variety that actually is more nitrogen use efficient. And some of our research programs are developing, for example, Nerica rice in Africa that's more nitrogen use efficient, or better ways to put that fertilizer into the soil so it's not lost to evaporation and it's right there where the plant needs it. So even as you're potentially increasing fertilizer use a little bit, you're also really increasing the efficiency, so you're getting quite a bit more crop for that fertilizer.